Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Basement Couch Contemplations. On this episode, I'm wanting to examine another concept of game design that seems to kind of become, in my opinion, a bit more of a growing issue, and that is the concept of game scale. What I mean by game scale is the physical space in which a player can explore, whether that's one giant location or many locations across the game. Throughout the generations of game development, games have gotten bigger and bigger, and that can lead to issues as well as new ways to experience games that have never been done before. So, a lot of innovation, but there is a point where it starts to break the fun of a game. When I look back at my childhood, I think about some of the games I really loved and how they changed over the years. One of those being the Jak and Daxter series, going from the first game, which had a lot of linear level design, and progression through it was limited by collectibles, and a lot of the typical elements of a platformer from the PS2 era were required to make your way through this linear world. So, scale-wise, it was probably not as small comparatively to the others as I look at it now. It was designed in such a way that the player didn't have the same levels of freedom and direction that they had in the later games, where you could really choose to go anywhere you wanted and interact with anybody in an open world setting rather than a linear design made to feel like an open world game. Another game that I could say the same of was the Sly Cooper games. The first one was designed in such a way that the player had these hub worlds that they would go to. It consisted as a level of its own, but really it was designed in such a way that it was like a chapter select. You would move into these different zones, which brought you into these extra levels. But in the later games, they started to make it where most of your missions could occur within this open world design, and there were missions here and there that were designed within separate, unique environments. When analyzing game scale, I feel like there are two ways to look at it. One is the current gen advancements, and then the advancements as you move into the next generation of consoles. For example, the Jak and Daxter Sly Cooper games that I had mentioned innovated within a generation. They expanded to become more open, more large scale, because they're sequels to a franchise and getting bigger and better to improve upon what was built in the first game. And then there's the leap in technology that there is with console generations that allows for much larger scale development. A lot bigger worlds can be created because the technology accommodates that. So there are some technological advancements that come into play when discussing this topic. But I have to question, because it's doable, does that mean it should be done? Are there things about larger and larger scale in games that can ruin the fun that makes a game experience unique? I'm going to analyze how game scale has changed throughout the history of game development. Just really breaking down each generation and how those things, how they've improved game design, and how we're now reaching a point where it's starting to ruin game design. To do that is going to be quite the feat, so I'm going to really just focus in on a few games within each generation. They may not even be the ideal game for that console generation, but they're games that I've personally experienced and can use as a reference to concepts that I want to explain. I also may not be covering all consoles or every console generation as thoroughly as I would others. I say this to put out there that I'm not going to do a full coverage of every game that's been designed. There may be games, even within older generations, that were really innovative and had game designs with really large scale that I didn't even realize were a thing. I'd love to hear about those games if you could share in the comments any experiences with games that you've had on earlier generation consoles that really were groundbreaking for game scale. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive right into this, and I'm going to start off by talking about what are the pros and what are the cons of game scale? As it gets bigger and bigger, what do we gain more of, and what do we lose more of? So one of the pros of a larger scale game is a more simulated experience. It has a more lifelike feeling, and there is a limitlessness. No boundaries to really hold the character back, or boundaries that are so large that they feel non-existent. There's an increased level of discovery to discover new locations that your friends that you want to discuss games with may never have been to, and just kind of that freshness of experience. The length of a game is another pro, depending on where you stand with your interest in how long games are, but that is also definitely increased by a game scale. And there are a lot of unscripted events that occur in worlds that are so large that the designers can't really control every way in which a player will experience every part of the world. As for the cons, more bugs is a big one. When a game gets too big, the development team, kind of similar to the unscripted events, they don't have the ability to know everywhere within such a massive world where issues could occur, and it becomes a hassle to really make a game as clean as possible when it's larger and larger in scale. Sometimes these can be game-breaking bugs, which really ruins the experience entirely, and sometimes it could just be silly things that actually give you a really good laugh. Another con could be that it's time-consuming, that a game just takes too long, and that the overall feel of the game that was fun at the beginning starts to become old faster than you'd hoped, or is just drawn out too long that it doesn't have the amount of depth that you want it to. Another con is moments of boredom or tediousness, where there's a lot of need to travel to places, and whether that's on foot without anything happening, or whether that's having to fast travel all the time. Just a lot of points where players may be in loading screens for hours of their experience with the game because of how often they have to do that. Another is lack of content. Sometimes, as much as there is more to do, there could be nothing that's really worth doing. Content that lacks interest or engagement for the player to have a desire to even accomplish it. And sometimes, if a game is too big, it can feel overwhelming. A player needs direction. They need to have that golden path, or at least some form of guidance towards a golden path that they can create for themselves. And if not, they can be overwhelmed, and that makes a game more stressful than enjoyable. I'm sure there are many more things I could talk about that are pros and cons to increased game scale, but I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll be breaking down ways in which these different aspects apply in modern games comparatively to older games. I want to share an analogy that I came up with that should illustrate some of the ideas and concepts that I'm trying to explain about game design in relation to game scale. I'm going to go through sharing a few games in each generation to display those concepts and how it changed over time. I'm calling this analogy the pool analogy. With this analogy, picture for yourself a small inflatable pool, little disc that's limited. Kids can't do much but splash in it, kind of sit in it. It's made for a specific audience, one that is very limited, and the activities and things you can do there are pretty restrictive. Then, picture a personal pool, and picture how the size of that is. It's a bit wider. It actually has some depth. People can swim under the water, play games in the water. You can have multiple people in this pool and do activities together that are much more varied. I see this as the kiddie pool being the first generation of games. We're talking about games like the original Super Mario Bros. Or the first Zelda, or Donkey Kong. Moving into the Super Nintendo era, talking about things like Super Mario World. Games where they're really just starting and they're very arcadey. The high score is more important than the completion of a narrative. When you go to the personal pool, I see that as more of moving further ahead in the generations into the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 era of games. Games like Zelda Ocarina of Time, Spyro, Final Fantasy VII, or Super Mario 64. Even the PlayStation 2 or GameCube or Xbox could fit within the personal pool category. It starts to make innovations later in their generations with games that implement more open world aspects, which later generations began to really build upon, such as the Jak and Daxter games, the Sly Cooper games, the Grand Theft Auto games, or even Spider-Man 2, kind of led the way in to this open world format that other games really took off with. Really, this era was a turning point for games in terms of how much developers prioritized the need for a larger scale of game. Going further into another body of water that's larger is the public pool. This is a place where lots of people can gather together. You can have some pretty unique experiences here. If your personal pool was too small, you couldn't have a diving board or a massive slide or lazy rivers, things that certain pools just don't have. So you have these new unique experiences, a lot larger space to explore. It's a place that, for most people, could be entertaining for potentially a lifetime, if not years of their life. This is a stage that I compare a bit more to like the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 era. Games like the Batman series, the Infamous series, and really any entry in the Assassin's Creed series has only grown larger and larger in scale. Even franchises such as Ratchet and Clank in this era began to expand so that it felt more open world and less linear. There starts to become what I think most modern games would see as true open world games. Games that when you look at its scale and its various activities that the player can engage in, quest lines, discovering things that aren't scripted and are not part of the main golden path. I think this generation really defines that better than any had before. Then we get to the next stage, which is the lake. A lake is just huge. There are so many things that you could not do in any of these previous bodies of water that you can do in a lake. You can take out your boat on it. You can paddleboard. You can ride jet skis. You can be kayaking. You can scuba dive in a lake. All these new and interesting ways to engage with your environment and world that, based on its scale, would take someone a lifetime to truly explore everything it had to offer. And it can have enjoyment for a lifetime. Games at this point, I see as the end of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, moving into the PS4 and Xbox One era. Games with huge worlds like Skyrim, GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, or the later entries of Assassin's Creed, such as Odyssey and Valhalla. This is a point where games have become very large, where there's almost too many things to do. It starts to dull with time because of the lack of unique experiences that the player has to engage with. This final part of the analogy is the place that I feel like we're going now with games, and this is where I get a bit afraid. This is the ocean stage. We are starting to make games that are so large, they're incomprehensible. They're so vast that the player could spend a whole lifetime just playing one game. But herein lies the issue. This scale is not enjoyable for as long as the developers hope they would be. Games like Starfield, No Man's Sky, or if things go wrong, Hello Games' new entry, Light No Fire. Like an ocean, these games have so many things, so many places you can go, so many things to do, but how many of those experiences are fun to have? How many are people willing to take the time to go and explore and enjoy? Like the ocean, out of all of its vastness, there's only a few places that we dedicate our time to. And I feel like developers are going into a place where they want to create worlds that are like this. Worlds that really offer a lot of places to go with not a lot to do. Most people make games with the intention to make them fun, and if you build your game too big and the places that fill the space that you play in are uneventful, then it gets boring really quick. One of the best examples I can give currently was playing Starfield. A lot of how that game was designed sounded amazing. I thought this was going to be Game of the Year. I thought it was going to be a huge success because what they had promised before the game came out was something that was amazing. The option to play a game so many different ways and with a world so big, a galaxy really, I felt like the experiences would be so fresh and different. The replayability would be immense. None of that was met. A lot of the planets were moons, and a lot of moons don't have life. And so the character doesn't have a whole lot to interact with. And even when you do find planets with life, most of your task is to scan those said life forms and kill them off if you want. But aside from that, there's not really any quests that are designated to go to certain planets or really drive the character to explore these places. There are contracts, in a sense. You can get tasks to survey planets, and that requires, scanning a certain amount of animals, finding unique geographic formations and things like that, which are fun for the first couple times you may do it. But after that, they feel really lazy and boring and repetitive, and it's just not a good design. There are a handful of planets that are worth your time, but sadly I felt like a lot of times these planets that did have meaningful things to do weren't even required of the player. They were kind of just left off to the side, felt incomplete. I think the best example of that was the Moon Titan. It's a pretty important lore location within this game, but there's not a single quest that isn't a miscellaneous quest that you get for this planet. And if there is a major quest, I never experienced it after completing the entire main quest line, various other side quest lines. So for me, Starfield was a big letdown in terms of it was unmet promises, and where it struggled, I think, was largely in the fact that they created a sandbox to experience really your sci-fi dream. None of it really lived up to what was presented before the game's release. And that really ranged from every aspect of the game's design, from the character traits that you can choose and the effects that they have on your gameplay, to the different skill trees and how much those actually change your experience, or just their built-in systems for your outposts and exploration, unique questing based on your backstory. None of that came through in the way they acted like it would. For me, it really was just one of the biggest letdowns in a long time for a game that sounded like it would really innovate the industry. Another example of a game that was just too big for it to be enjoyable was No Man's Sky. It came out, and I actually had a unique experience with this game. I borrowed it from a friend and played it, but I had just installed the game and started to play as soon as it allowed me to play, meaning I hadn't patched the game. So I played it just naturally, and I was basically just mining minerals off of rocks, and then I started to fly and realized I could really fly the distance between the planets if I wanted to, but that was going to be extremely boring. I feel like I made it to a space station, and when I got there, There were a couple people I could interact with. I don't even remember if you could actually understand their language or if parts of the language were not understandable. There was really nothing happening and nothing going on at all. And so I kind of felt lost and didn't know what to do with myself. And then I ended up either the game froze or I had quit out and come back to it later. And I had finished installing the patch. And when I went back in, there were so many characters in that space station. I didn't play much more of the game before I returned it to my friend, but I got quest lines and a few other things that didn't exist before that really were driving me to do things, to really explore and build an outpost, I think was one of them. Before I was just wandering and had no idea what I was doing. So I think that's a good example of a game that it learned that it had an awesome scale, which is what their first goal was, but they didn't fill it with meaningful content. I feel like a series that's done larger and larger scaled games really well has been the Assassin's Creed games. They changed a bit once they entered Assassin's Creed Origins. They made it more RPG based with a lot more explorative activities. Things where you're given more purpose to actually explore the world for rare treasure, for better gear, different items that motivate the player to interact with this space. And wherever you went, you got to feel like there was a reason to go there. Also, the Assassin's Creed games have a lot of goals in the way they're designed. So a lot of times after you've completed the main story, there's more endgame content where there are these rare bosses, which you can fight before finishing the main game content, but just more things that you're striving for, whether that requires a higher skill level or better gear. You're able to tackle those things after you may feel like you've almost done everything you could in this world. I don't think that this makes these games free from criticism, because there are a lot of repetitive aspects about these games that a lot of the things you do may feel fresh because they're designed differently, whether it's, raiding another outpost or overthrowing a village in Valhalla. There can be a sameness to these activities, but they have mechanics within the game, such as your skill trees, where you can play in very different ways, which can make these combat experiences a lot more varied. Now, don't get me wrong, to compare Assassin's Creed to Starfield or No Man's Sky is a bit of a stretch, because the scale and scope is so largely different. Assassin's Creed games really exist in where you are in one large map, versus Starfield or No Man's Sky, you're in an immensely large universe. That is currently not the case for many games that they're designed that way, but when a game is advertised, I feel like the scale is important in its advertising. All throughout the Assassin's Creed franchise's development, it has made it a point that their maps are larger and larger. They would even go so far as to compare the previous games' map size to the new game's map size, and a lot of games do that nowadays. But I feel like Assassin's Creed was where I first started noticing it, is that one of the selling points is the scale of the game. And I think that same selling point is being made, but now it's on an even larger scale. It has to be that you can go to infinite procedural worlds where there's infinite choices that you can make in a story, that the quantity of endings to a game is what has value to the game. And it's really a departure from what used to be, here's a condensed story with a lot of really impactful moments that you can experience within a reasonable amount of time. Now, the focus is on building something big and keeping people's eyes on it for years to come. For example, Lighten Up Fire is the next game being made by Hello Games, and it has a very similar vibe to No Man's Sky in that its big selling point is how massive this game is going to be. It's going to be the size of Earth. The game is not going to be a minimized version, a condensed, smaller version of Earth. It is planned to be scaled to the size of a planet. To me, this doesn't sound appealing. It can sound appealing if they don't make the mistakes they made before, and that they actually really fill this planet with a variety of things you can do that doesn't grow old too quickly. That there are, like Earth, maybe unexplored islands that could take years for people to explore. It could be almost like a Ready Player One experience, where there's an Easter egg that takes people 10 to 20 years to find, and while they're actively searching. That would actually really reshape the game industry. But I have this fear that they're going to kind of fall into old game design while they try to create this unimaginable game that's never really existed. They're going to make a lot of empty spaces that you have to cross over, just like in real life. The giant ocean, there's only a small percentage of worthwhile places to go and experience out of the amount of places that are just empty and full of water. I personally prefer games with a lot more depth than scale. I enjoy a game that doesn't have to do a whole lot to give you a good time. One of the games I've been playing recently is Helldivers 2, and to me, it's really a rare game to see today, where it has so little to it, but it has so much that you can experience. That has really only 3 places, 3 settings in the game. You're on your ship, you're looking at a map, or you are on the planet completing a mission. The way that they give this so much depth is the amount of missions you have vary greatly. The amount of difficulty levels you have change the experience. Not only does it push you to get better at the game, but it also makes it so you have more objectives while you're on your mission to complete, which creates an intensity to make sure you can accomplish this with harder enemies to fight. And their progression system doesn't leave you feeling like you're just slogging away and nothing is changing. Their progression system unlocks new weapons and new ways to play the game with their stratagems. The only thing that takes a while to get are things that don't really change your experience. Things that give you passive buffs, small percentage increases to your stratagems. And I'm not saying that games shouldn't become bigger or continue to be immensely large. What I'm trying to say is the developers should make sure they don't focus too much on the scale of their game, and they should focus more on, is the content within this worth our players' time? Is this something where they'll find new and refreshing experiences around every corner? Or will it take them hours to get to a point where they can finally enjoy the game? So what is the solution? If a developer is going to make a game that's larger and larger, I don't know that there's any one right answer, but I think at its core, they have to always remember player engagement. The player really needs to find a drive and desire to reach goals. They need to be motivated to do something. And that motivation has to lead them to a payoff that's worth their time. So I think some of what that means is that devs need to avoid relying on checklisting, creating quests and objectives to the player that are just checking off a box, creating more unique experiences that they can talk about that others may not have, experiences that they can't have because of how rare and unique that experience is. Creating motivation that pushes players to explore the world they've built, but also rewards them for doing so. And creating a progression system within the games that doesn't grow old and that really changes the way you experience the game loop that you'll be playing for hours and hours. So in regards to something like Starfield, if they're going to promote
The thing that I enjoy most about the game is the freedom to be who you want to be, do what you want to do.
That needs to really pay off. The character needs to have a brand new, unique experience. If they choose totally different starting traits and backgrounds, that should change the way they play. I chose the wanted background for one of my playthroughs, and from what they had said, I would be hunted by bounty hunters, I would have conflict with security forces, and after 20 hours playing as that character, I never once ran into a single group that attacked me because of my backstory, and I never, ever had any issues with people on the security force. That kind of ruined the concept for me. It doesn't make it worth anything. There's no motivation to replay the game when any path you choose will lead to you doing the exact same thing you've already done. And I'm not saying that games shouldn't become bigger or continue to be immensely large. What I'm trying to say is the developers should make sure they don't focus too much on the scale of their game, and they should focus more on, is the content within this worth our players' time? Is this something where they'll find new and refreshing experiences around every corner? Or will it take them hours to get to a point where they can finally enjoy the game? And games will fail, games will succeed. Many games won't follow this formula. They still don't, and probably won't. But it seems to be a trend that they have to go bigger to be better. I hope games keep coming out that continue to push and change and really innovate the industry. But I hope in that journey they don't lose track of the need to create a fun experience for everyone who plays their games. Light No Fire, I hope, does immensely well, and I hope that as more comes forward with it, I'll be wrong, and that the game will have so many amazing things about it that I'll just be drawn in for many, many hours. Other games like Elder Scrolls 6, I hope that Starfield isn't a bad omen before that game comes out that shows that Bethesda can't innovate. I hope that it's a lesson. It helps them learn the need to create the level of engagement that their previous titles have had that have really made them so great in the past. Well, those are my thoughts on this topic, and I hope you guys were able to enjoy it. Let me know what you think. Are games just fine as they are? Is the scale not the issue, and it's really just the developers really just don't know how to make fun games? Is it fine for games to keep growing? Or would you too like a return back to smaller scale games? Back to older formulas from different generations? Let me know what you think. So until next time, keep on gaming and keep on creating.